My beloved child, something unusual happened the moment your name entered a conversation you were never supposed to hear about. The third party had been calm only seconds earlier, almost certain that everything was still under control, but then one small detail surfaced, something your soulmate had kept private for far longer than anyone realized, and suddenly the entire mood changed. There was no dramatic scene, no raised voices, no cruel exchange. It was quieter than that. Your soulmate simply stopped pretending that one particular truth did not matter. And perhaps that is why the third party wishes you would turn away now, because what is slowly coming into the open is not a scandal, not a frightening revelation, and not some impossible promise. It is something much more personal, the reason your soulmate has never been able to place you in the same category as everyone else. Don't skip this part, because the secret did not begin with a confession. It began with hesitation. Your soulmate was asked an ordinary question, the kind of question that should have been easy to answer, yet they became strangely quiet. Someone noticed. The third party noticed too. And in that silence, something hidden became visible without a single word being spoken. For a long time, your soulmate had found ways to explain you away. They told themselves that the connection was simply memorable because the timing was complicated. They convinced themselves that the thoughts of you would eventually become less frequent, that distance would make everything clearer, that ordinary routines would eventually replace the emotions they did not know how to name. Yet there was one problem with every explanation they created: you kept returning to their mind at moments when they were not looking for you. Not constantly. Not obsessively. Just meaningfully. A familiar phrase would remind them of something you once said. A certain kind of quiet would bring back the way they felt when they did not need to perform around you. Sometimes they would hear someone describe the kind of relationship they hoped to have one day, and without intending to, your soulmate would compare those words with what they had already experienced with you. That comparison became the secret. Not because they were ashamed of it, but because admitting it would force them to face a question they had carefully avoided: what if the connection they were trying to move beyond was actually the standard by which every other connection was being measured? The third party sensed this long before your soulmate admitted it. That is where the strange tension began. They could see that certain subjects changed your soulmate's expression. They noticed how conversations about the future created a pause. They noticed how your soulmate could speak confidently about work, responsibilities, plans, friendships, and nearly everything else, yet become unexpectedly thoughtful whenever love became personal. At first, the third party believed that silence had nothing to do with you. Maybe your soulmate simply needed more time. Maybe they were uncertain about relationships in general. Maybe the past had left them cautious. Those explanations were comfortable, so everyone accepted them. Then someone mentioned you indirectly. Not even your full name at first. Just a memory connected to you. And your soulmate's response was so immediate that the third party understood something they had been trying not to understand. Your soulmate remembered the smallest detail. Think about that for a moment. It was not some grand event that gave everything away. It was something almost insignificant, something most people would have forgotten completely. Yet your soulmate remembered exactly when it happened, what you said, and even the feeling surrounding that moment. Someone smiled and asked, almost teasingly, "You still remember that?" Your soulmate tried to make the answer casual. Some things just stay with you. 5 ordinary words. But the third party heard what was underneath them. Some things just stay with you. The room moved on, but your soulmate did not, at least not completely. Their attention remained somewhere behind their eyes, as though a door had opened to a memory they had spent months keeping closed. And this is where the secret begins changing shape, because what your soulmate had hidden was not simply that they still thought about you. That would have been too easy. Something deeper had been happening. Every time they imagined what emotional safety might feel like, your presence appeared somewhere in the picture. Not because you were perfect. Not because every moment between you had been effortless. In fact, part of what made the realization so powerful was that your soulmate remembered the imperfect moments too, the misunderstandings, the distance, the things neither of you knew how to say at the right time. Yet beneath all of that, there had been something unusually difficult to replace, the feeling that you saw parts of them they usually kept hidden. And perhaps you know that feeling yourself. Perhaps there were moments when you wondered whether you had imagined the depth of what existed between you. Maybe you questioned whether those quiet looks meant anything, whether the conversation stayed with them the way they stayed with you, whether the distance erased what once felt meaningful. Something important is waiting for you in this realization. People do not always understand the value of emotional safety while they are standing inside it. Sometimes they only recognize it after they enter spaces where they have to explain themselves again. Your soulmate learned this slowly. Around other people, they noticed themselves editing sentences, holding back certain thoughts, smiling when they wanted to be quiet, saying, "I'm fine," because explaining the deeper answer felt exhausting. Then a memory of you would appear, and they would remember how there had been moments when silence with you did not need to be fixed. That difference unsettled them. It also created the first crack in the story they had been telling themselves. The third party began asking questions, carefully at first. Are you still holding on to something? Your soulmate denied it. And in a way, they were telling the truth. They were not deliberately holding on to you. They had not built their days around waiting. They were living, changing, learning, trying to move forward. Yet there is a difference between holding on to someone and discovering that a connection changed the way you understand love. Your soulmate had not realized that distinction until recently. Then came the moment nobody expected. A conversation about the future turned personal, and someone asked your soulmate what they actually wanted, not what was practical, not what would make sense to everyone else, but what they wanted if nobody was judging the answer. Your soulmate laughed at first. The third party laughed too. But the question remained. And when the laughter faded, your soulmate became quiet. Their answer came slowly. I want something that feels honest. Someone asked, what does honest mean to you? Your soulmate looked down for a moment, and what they said next changed the atmosphere completely. Being able to be myself without wondering whether I'm too much or not enough. The third party's expression changed. Because they had heard your soulmate use almost those exact words once before while speaking about you. Suddenly, pieces that had remained separate began connecting. The secret was not a hidden message, a secret meeting, or some dramatic plan. The secret was that your soulmate had quietly built their definition of real connection around what they once felt when they were with you. And they had never told anyone. Stay till the end of this moment, because the third party's reaction reveals why they suddenly became so uncomfortable with anything that might bring this truth closer to you. They realized they had been competing with something they could not imitate, not your appearance, not your history, not some perfect version of you, but an emotional memory. A feeling. A standard. The more they tried to prove that the past no longer mattered, the more obvious it became that your soulmate was not comparing people consciously. The comparison happened on its own. One person could offer attention, yet your soulmate remembered understanding. Someone could offer excitement, yet your soulmate remembered peace. Someone could say all the correct things, yet your soulmate remembered the moments when you seemed to understand what they meant before they found the right words. None of this made the third party a villain. That matters. They are human too. They wanted certainty. They wanted to believe that if enough time passed, your soulmate's emotional history would become irrelevant. But now they were facing something uncomfortable. Time had not erased the meaning. It had clarified it. So when the third party seemed almost to say, "Don't look deeper into this," what they were really protecting was not a terrible secret. They were protecting the version of the story in which your soulmate had completely moved on without ever reconsidering what you meant. That version had begun falling apart. And still, there is another layer your soulmate has told almost no one. One night, long after everyone assumed the subject was finished, your soulmate reopened something connected to you. Maybe it was an old conversation, a photograph, a saved note, or simply a memory triggered by something they came across unexpectedly. They did not reach out. They did not make some impulsive decision. They just sat there and looked at it longer than they intended. What surprised them was not sadness. It was clarity. They remembered who they were during that chapter of their life, and they noticed something they had never fully appreciated before. Around you, they had been trying to become more honest. You had somehow brought certain questions to the surface. What do I really want? Why am I afraid to say what I feel? Why do I keep choosing what is easier instead of what feels meaningful? Those questions had followed them even after distance entered the story. Suddenly, your soulmate understood that you had not merely been part of their romantic history. The connection had influenced their personal growth. That was the secret they found hardest to admit, because it meant losing you or becoming distant from you had not made the connection meaningless. It had made its impact easier to see. Then something even quieter happened. Your soulmate began recognizing ways they had misunderstood you. They remembered moments when you had stepped back, and at the time they interpreted your distance as indifference. Looking back, they wondered whether you had simply been protecting your heart. They remembered times when you did not chase after clarity, and they once assumed that meant you did not care enough. Now they wondered whether you had been waiting for them to meet you halfway. They remembered occasions when you seemed unusually quiet, and only later did they realize you might have been carrying emotions you did not know how to explain. This did not turn the past into a perfect love story. It did something more grounded. It allowed your soulmate to see that both of you may have been responding to uncertainty in different ways. And once that realization entered their mind, another question became impossible to avoid: what would have happened if we had both understood this sooner? The third party heard part of that question. Not directly, but enough. Your soulmate was speaking with someone they trusted when they finally admitted, "I think I understood them too late." Silence followed. The person listening did not immediately respond. Neither did your soulmate. That sentence seemed to surprise even the person who said it. Because sometimes a truth becomes real only after you hear yourself speak it aloud. What do you mean? The other person finally asked. Your soulmate hesitated. This was the boundary. They could change the subject and return everything to safety. They almost did. Then they said, I thought they wanted too much from me. Now I think they were asking for honesty, and I wasn't ready to give it. Somewhere nearby, the third party heard enough to understand exactly who was being discussed. And for the first time, their concern was not that your soulmate secretly wanted to run backward into the past. Their concern was that your soulmate had finally stopped blaming the connection for feelings they had never learned how to handle. That kind of realization changes people. Not overnight. Not magically. But quietly, from the inside. Your soulmate began looking at their own choices differently. They began asking whether they had confused emotional distance with maturity. Whether they had chosen silence because speaking honestly felt too vulnerable. Whether they had allowed outside opinions to influence something that should have been understood between two people. And here is the detail the third party never expected your soulmate to admit. Your name had come up more than once. Not as gossip. Not as a complaint. Your soulmate had begun speaking about you with a softness that had not been there before. They were no longer trying to prove that they were unaffected. They were simply acknowledging that you mattered. That distinction was everything. One person finally asked them directly, if you could speak to them without fear of getting the wrong reaction, what would you say? Your soulmate went still. A few seconds passed. Then they smiled, not happily, not sadly, but with the expression of someone who had just encountered a truth they could no longer avoid. I'd tell them I understand now. But that was not the entire answer. There were more words behind it, words they stopped themselves from saying because the third party was closer than they realized. And those unfinished words are exactly where the secret becomes something far more personal, because later that same evening, your soulmate finally completed the sentence when they believed nobody else could hear. What they said after, I understand now, explains why the third party suddenly wants this entire subject to disappear, and why your soulmate may be closer than ever to admitting what you actually meant to them. The sentence your soulmate never finished in front of anyone returned later that night, and this time there was nobody there to interrupt it. The room had become quiet, the kind of quiet that makes ordinary thoughts suddenly sound louder, and your soulmate found themselves replaying that earlier question again. If you could speak to them without worrying about the reaction, what would you actually say? At first they tried to dismiss it. They picked up their phone, put it down, walked toward another room, returned, and told themselves there was no reason to keep thinking about something that belonged to another chapter. Yet the unfinished answer kept following them. I'd tell them I understand now. Understand what? That was the part nobody had heard. That was the part your soulmate had avoided saying because once those words became specific, there would be no easy way to pretend the realization meant nothing. And eventually, almost as though they were confessing it only to themselves, they whispered the rest. I understand why they stopped trying to convince me. There it was. Not a grand declaration. Not some impossible promise. Just a sentence filled with delayed understanding. Your soulmate had spent so long believing that if you truly cared, you would keep explaining, keep reaching, keep proving, keep returning whenever they became uncertain. But now they were beginning to see how unfair that expectation had been. Perhaps you had tried. Perhaps more than once. Perhaps there came a point when protecting your own peace mattered more than repeatedly asking someone to recognize what had already been placed in front of them. Your soulmate remembered moments differently now. A conversation they once considered insignificant suddenly carried a new meaning. A message they thought sounded distant now felt restrained rather than cold. A moment when you stepped back no longer looked like rejection. It looked like someone quietly deciding not to force what should have been mutual. And something about that realization stayed with them. Don't skip this part, because this is where the third party's discomfort becomes easier to understand. The secret was not merely that your soulmate remembered you. The secret was that their entire interpretation of the past was changing. For a long time, they had relied on one simple story: things did not work because the connection was too complicated. That explanation made everything easier. No one had to examine timing. No one had to examine fear. No one had to ask whether pride, confusion, or outside opinions had shaped decisions that should have been made from a clearer place. But when your soulmate finally started looking honestly at those questions, the old explanation stopped feeling complete. They realized that complicated had sometimes been another word for, I did not know how to handle what I was feeling. That realization was uncomfortable, but strangely freeing. It meant the past was not proof that the connection had been meaningless. It was proof that both people may have been navigating something they did not yet know how to communicate. And there was one specific memory that your soulmate could no longer ignore. It happened during an ordinary conversation between you, long before everything became distant. You had said something simple about wanting consistency. At the time, your soulmate heard pressure in those words. They thought you were asking for certainty they could not provide. Yet now, after experiencing other connections and reflecting on their own behavior, they understood that consistency was never about demanding perfection. You were asking not to be left guessing about whether you mattered. That memory hit differently now. Your soulmate remembered your expression. They remembered how carefully you had chosen your words. They remembered that you did not accuse them of anything. You simply tried to explain what made you feel secure. And instead of leaning closer to understand, they became defensive because they interpreted vulnerability as expectation. That was one of the moments they wished they could revisit, not to change every detail, but simply to respond with more maturity. I should have listened, they admitted quietly. They did not know the third party would eventually learn about that sentence. But they did. And when they heard it, something shifted. Up until that point, the third party had been able to believe your soulmate's memories of you were mostly sentimental. Nostalgia happens. People remember old chapters. It does not automatically mean anything needs to change. But regret mixed with understanding was different. It meant your soulmate was no longer simply remembering the connection, they were learning from it. The third party began asking more questions than usual. Why are you thinking about this now? Your soulmate did not answer immediately. I don't know, they said. But they did know. They simply were not ready to say it. The truth was that something had happened recently that made everything sharper. Someone had treated your soulmate in a way that reminded them of something you used to do effortlessly. It was not romantic. It was barely noticeable to anyone else. Your soulmate had been speaking about something important, and the other person interrupted them repeatedly. Nothing cruel happened. Nobody argued. Yet when your soulmate eventually became quiet, they remembered how differently you used to respond. You listened. Not perfectly every time, but enough that they remembered feeling heard. That comparison followed them for the rest of the day. And suddenly, your soulmate understood something they had never properly valued: attention is not the same as being understood. Someone can spend hours around you and still never truly listen. Someone can send constant messages and still miss what you are trying to say. And sometimes the person who speaks less is the person who notices more. Your soulmate remembered how you noticed changes in their mood before they explained them. How you could sense when a joke was hiding exhaustion. How you sometimes gave them space without making that space feel like abandonment. The memory felt surprisingly warm. Then came a thought they had resisted for a long time: maybe what I miss is not the past. Maybe I miss who I was allowed to be around them. That thought changed everything. Stay till the end of this realization, because it explains why the third party's reaction grew stronger even though your soulmate had still made no dramatic decision. The third party could handle a memory. They could handle nostalgia. What unsettled them was seeing your soulmate become more honest with themselves. Because honest reflection rarely stays contained. Once someone begins asking why a certain connection affected them so deeply, they naturally begin examining what they want now. Your soulmate started doing exactly that. They looked at their present life and asked uncomfortable but necessary questions. Am I choosing relationships because they truly fit me, or because they are easier to explain? Am I avoiding certain emotions because they are wrong for me, or because they require courage? Have I been calling myself over it, when what I really meant was, I learned to avoid thinking about it? These questions did not immediately lead to answers. But they opened something that had been closed. And then your name surfaced again. This time, your soulmate was with someone who had known them for years, someone who remembered the earlier chapter and had watched everything unfold from a distance. They asked, "Why do you think you still speak about them differently?" Your soulmate frowned. Differently how? The person smiled. You defend everyone else with logic. You defend them with feeling. Your soulmate went completely quiet. That sentence reached somewhere deeper than they expected. They tried to laugh it off. That doesn't mean anything. But their friend did not argue. Maybe. I'm just telling you what I notice. The conversation moved forward, but your soulmate remained stuck on those words. You defend them with feeling. They began thinking about every time someone had misunderstood you and they had corrected them. Every time someone reduced the connection to something shallow and your soulmate instinctively insisted, it wasn't like that. Every time the third party made an assumption about your intentions and your soulmate responded more quickly than necessary. Why had they done that if you no longer mattered? The answer that came was uncomfortable because it was simple, because some part of them still wanted the truth of who you were to be protected, even when they had not protected the connection itself. Something important is waiting for you here. Your soulmate's deepest secret was becoming less about romantic longing and more about recognition. They were realizing that they had carried respect for you through every stage of the distance, even during moments when confusion covered it. That respect had never disappeared. Sometimes it hid behind frustration. Sometimes behind silence. Sometimes behind attempts to move forward. But whenever someone described you unfairly, something inside your soulmate resisted. They knew you were more complicated, more thoughtful, more human than the simplified version anyone else could create. The third party noticed that resistance too. And one evening, frustration finally slipped into their voice. Why do you always explain them? Your soulmate looked surprised. Explain who? They both knew. The third party did not repeat your name. You know who. Your soulmate became still. This could have become an argument, but it did not. Instead, your soulmate asked something unexpected. Do I? The third party stared at them. Your soulmate looked away, almost embarrassed by their own question. Do I really talk about them that much? Silence answered first. Then the third party said, not constantly. That's what makes it worse. Your soulmate turned back. What does that mean? And the answer they received forced another truth into the open. You only bring them up when something matters. That sentence landed slowly. Not constantly. Only when something matters. When someone discussed loyalty, your name somehow entered the conversation. When someone spoke about emotional safety, a memory of you appeared. When your soulmate talked about regrets, you existed somewhere in the background. When they described the kind of person who had challenged them to become more honest, your story was never far away. Your soulmate had not realized there was a pattern. The third party had. And now the pattern had been spoken aloud. Your soulmate could not unhear it. Later that night, they opened their phone again. This time they did not search through old messages. They simply looked at your name where it still existed somewhere in their digital life. Maybe in an old contact. Maybe in a forgotten thread. Maybe connected to a photograph or memory. Their thumb hovered there for a second. They did nothing. That matters. Because this was not about impulsive action. It was about the moment before action, the moment when someone recognizes that something unresolved still deserves honesty. Your soulmate asked themselves a question: if I reached out, what would I actually be trying to accomplish? The first answer was obvious. Curiosity. They wanted to know how you were. But beneath curiosity was something more vulnerable. They wanted to know whether the version of you in their memory still existed. Whether you had changed. Whether they had changed enough for a conversation between you to feel different now. Then came another thought that made them set the phone down immediately: what if they are happier without me? Your soulmate had never seriously considered that possibility before. Not because they assumed you were waiting, but because their internal story had always been centered on their own confusion. Suddenly they imagined your life moving forward without them. They pictured you laughing more easily, sleeping peacefully, building routines that no longer included wondering where you stood. Strangely, the thought did not make them angry. It made them tender. They realized they wanted good things for you even if those good things did not involve them. And that was perhaps the most revealing feeling of all. Because attachment asks, do I still have a place? Care asks, are they okay? Your soulmate recognized the difference. And for the first time, they admitted something they had never been willing to say: I think I cared more than I knew how to show. That confession was not heard by the third party directly. But what happened the following day gave it away. Your soulmate became quieter than usual. More reflective. They stopped participating when conversations turned into speculation about you. At one point, the third party made a casual comment suggesting that you had probably forgotten everything by now. Your soulmate did not react dramatically. They simply said, maybe. And if they have, I hope they're doing well. The third party stared at them, expecting bitterness, jealousy, anything that would prove the connection had become something small. Instead they heard respect. That was when their fear of the truth changed into something closer to resignation. Because they realized they could not make your soulmate resent you. And strangely, the more they tried to minimize what you meant, the more your soulmate remembered why you had mattered. A little later, the third party finally asked the question they had been avoiding. If they came back into your life tomorrow, what would you do? Your soulmate did not answer quickly. The pause lasted long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then they said, I wouldn't pretend nothing happened. The third party exhaled, almost relieved, assuming that meant your soulmate would close the door. But then your soulmate continued. I'd want to talk about it properly. That was the secret beginning to expose itself fully. Your soulmate did not fantasize about erasing the past and starting over as though nothing had happened. They wanted something more mature than that. A real conversation. Accountability. Understanding. A chance to say what they had failed to say before. And the third party knew exactly what that could mean. Not necessarily reunion. Not certainty. But possibility. And possibility was enough to change the atmosphere. The third party asked, what would you even say? Your soulmate looked toward the window, searching for words. I'd say I'm sorry for making them question whether they mattered. Nothing moved for a moment. Even your soulmate seemed surprised by the honesty of that sentence. Then they added, and I'd tell them I finally understand why they got tired. That was the completed confession. The sentence they had whispered alone had now been spoken in front of someone else. It could no longer be hidden inside private reflection. The third party's face changed because the secret had moved from thought into language. And once someone says something like that aloud, the next question becomes inevitable. Do you still love them? The room became impossibly still. Your soulmate did not answer. Not because the answer was simple and they were hiding it, but because the word love felt too large for everything they were trying to understand. They did not want to confuse memory with love, regret with love, affection with love, or unfinished emotion with love. So instead of giving the easy dramatic answer, your soulmate said something far more revealing. I don't know what to call it anymore. I just know they still matter to me. The third party looked down. Your soulmate continued, almost as though the words had finally found their own momentum. And I think pretending they don't matter has made me less honest with everyone, including myself. There it was, the secret behind the secret. Your soulmate was not hiding some sensational event. They had been hiding the fact that their feelings about you had never fit neatly into the box they created for them. They had tried to label the connection finished before understanding what it had actually taught them. They had tried to move forward without first becoming honest about what they were carrying forward with them. And now that honesty was beginning to surface. The third party was no longer begging the truth to disappear because they feared something terrible. They feared something profoundly ordinary and therefore impossible to control: clarity. You cannot argue someone out of clarity. You cannot demand that someone stop understanding their own history. You cannot compete with a lesson another person has already learned. So the third party did something unexpected. Their tone softened. Then maybe you need to figure out what you actually feel. Your soulmate looked at them, surprised. There was no anger in the sentence. Just fatigue and realism. For perhaps the first time, both of them understood that keeping your name out of conversation would not resolve anything. Your soulmate needed to answer the questions inside themselves first. And the next thing they did revealed more than any confession so far. They went somewhere alone, opened a blank message addressed to you, and began typing. The first sentence was deleted. So was the second. Then the third. They kept trying to find words that did not sound dramatic, selfish, or designed to reopen old wounds. Eventually, only one line remained on the screen: "There's something I should have understood a long time ago." Your soulmate stared at that line for several minutes. They did not send it. Not yet. Because what they planned to write underneath it carried the final piece of the secret, and it was not simply an apology. It was the one realization about you that your soulmate had never admitted even to themselves until that exact moment. Your soulmate kept staring at that unfinished message because the next sentence required something they had avoided for a very long time: admitting that the person they had misunderstood most was not you, but themselves. The words on the screen remained simple: "There's something I should have understood a long time ago," yet beneath that sentence was an entire history they were finally seeing from a different angle. They had spent so much time asking whether you had cared enough, whether you had stayed long enough, whether you had explained yourself clearly enough, that they had rarely asked the harder question: had they ever created a space where you could feel safe enough to keep trying? That realization did not arrive dramatically. It came quietly, almost gently, and perhaps that is why it affected them so deeply. Your soulmate remembered how often they had expected you to interpret their silence correctly. When they pulled away, they hoped you would somehow know they were overwhelmed rather than uninterested. When they became distant, they hoped you would understand that fear was speaking louder than their feelings. When they avoided certain conversations, they expected you to recognize that uncertainty did not necessarily mean absence of care. But at the same time, when you became quiet, they interpreted your silence in the harshest possible way. They assumed you were losing interest. They assumed you had stopped caring. They assumed your distance meant goodbye. And suddenly the imbalance was impossible to ignore. They had wanted understanding from you while offering you confusion in return. That was the realization they had never admitted. Their fingers moved toward the keyboard again. This time they typed slowly: "I expected you to understand things I never had the courage to explain." They stopped. Read it once. Then again. The sentence felt almost too honest, but they did not erase it. Something had changed. For the first time, your soulmate was not trying to make themselves look better inside the story. They were trying to see the story accurately. And that is when another memory surfaced, one they had pushed aside because it made them uncomfortable. There had been a moment when you asked a simple question about where you stood in their life. Nothing extreme. Nothing unreasonable. You were not asking for impossible certainty. You wanted clarity. Yet instead of answering directly, your soulmate had become vague. They thought vagueness would protect both of you from disappointment. In reality, it left you carrying questions alone. Your soulmate could now remember the exact change in your energy afterward. You did not argue. You did not create a scene. You simply became a little quieter. At the time, they thought that silence meant you were emotionally withdrawing. Now they understood that perhaps you had simply heard the answer hidden inside their inability to answer. And something about that broke through the final layer of defensiveness they had been carrying. Not guilt in a destructive way. Not shame. Something healthier, responsibility. They could finally look back and say, I could have handled that differently. That sentence became strangely freeing. Because once someone stops fighting to prove they did nothing wrong, they can finally learn what they would do differently now. Don't skip what happened next, because this is where the third party realized your soulmate's secret was no longer something that could be pushed back into silence. The following day, your soulmate met the same person who had earlier asked what they would say if they could speak to you openly. Their friend noticed immediately that something was different. You figured something out, didn't you? Your soulmate smiled faintly. Maybe. About them? Another pause. This time your soulmate did not deny it. About me. That answer changed the conversation completely. Their friend waited. Your soulmate continued. I kept thinking they left because they didn't care enough. But what if they left because I kept making them prove they cared? The friend said nothing for several seconds. Not because the answer was shocking, but because it was real. Your soulmate looked down. I think I made them feel like they were asking for too much when they were really asking me to meet them emotionally. The words came easier now. And maybe I kept calling it pressure because admitting I was scared would have meant I had to do something about it. There was no dramatic music in that moment, no perfect revelation that solved every unresolved feeling. Just one person becoming more emotionally honest than they had been before. And somewhere nearby, the third party heard enough of the conversation to understand that this was no longer simply about whether your soulmate missed you. Missing someone can fade. Nostalgia can soften. But personal growth tied to a specific relationship becomes part of a person's identity. Your soulmate was beginning to understand themselves through the way they had treated you. That was what made the situation impossible to dismiss. The third party had hoped your name would eventually become irrelevant. Instead, your name had become connected to a lesson your soulmate did not want to forget. And perhaps the most surprising thing was that your soulmate was no longer angry at you for stepping away. In fact, they were beginning to respect you for it. They remembered how you had stopped forcing conversations once you realized they were not meeting you halfway. They remembered the dignity in that decision. They remembered that you had not tried to punish them. You had simply stopped abandoning yourself to maintain something uncertain. At the time, your soulmate had experienced your withdrawal as rejection. Now they saw another possibility: maybe you had chosen self-respect. That possibility changed the emotional balance completely. Your soulmate had spent so long imagining themselves as the person who had been left behind that they had never considered whether you had been the one waiting for emotional reciprocity until waiting began costing too much. This was the secret underneath everything. Your soulmate had not merely underestimated your feelings. They had underestimated your strength. They had assumed that because you cared deeply, you would remain available indefinitely. They had mistaken your patience for permanence. And when you finally became quieter, they assumed the connection had meant less to you than they thought. Now they were realizing the opposite could have been true. Maybe you stepped back precisely because it meant so much. Maybe distance was not proof of indifference. Maybe it was the boundary of someone who had already tried to communicate in every way they knew how. Your soulmate returned to the unsent message that evening. The sentence was still there. "There's something I should have understood a long time ago. Underneath it, I expected you to understand things I never had the courage to explain." They added another line. "And I think I mistook your boundaries for rejection." Again, they paused. Their thumb hovered over the screen. They could feel how easily a message like this could become selfish if they were not careful. They did not want to appear suddenly simply because clarity had arrived late. They did not want to enter your peace without considering whether you had worked hard to create it. So they did something unexpected. They closed the message without sending it and began writing somewhere else, almost like a letter meant only for themselves. "What do I actually want from them?" they wrote. The answer did not come immediately. A younger version of your soulmate might have written, "I want them back." But that was not what appeared. Instead, "I want them to know they were not imagining it." Your soulmate stared at those words. Something important is waiting for you here, because this was the confession nobody around them had expected. Your soulmate's deepest regret was not simply losing closeness with you. It was realizing that their inconsistency may have caused you to question whether the connection had ever been real for them. They suddenly understood how painful ambiguity can be. When someone gives warmth one day and distance the next, the person receiving it often begins doubting their own perception. Your soulmate wondered whether they had made you do exactly that. Did you ever replay conversations and ask yourself whether you had misread everything? Did you ever wonder whether the tenderness you noticed was real, or whether you had imagined it because you wanted it to be true? Did you ever blame yourself for caring more deeply than you intended? Your soulmate could not know every answer, but the possibility affected them. Because now they wanted you to understand something they had been incapable of saying when it mattered most: you had not imagined your importance. Their confusion had been real, yes. Their fear had been real. Their distance had been real. But so had the care underneath it. And admitting both things at once felt far more mature than pretending one cancelled out the other. The third party discovered part of this when they saw your soulmate writing late one evening. "Are you messaging them?" they asked. Your soulmate looked up quickly. No. The answer was true. The message remained unsent. The third party seemed relieved for half a second. Then your soulmate added, "I'm trying to understand what I would say if I ever did." That honesty removed the relief immediately. "Why do you need to say anything?" the third party asked. There was emotion in their voice, but no cruelty. Your soulmate thought carefully before responding. Because sometimes silence protects you, and sometimes silence just leaves someone carrying the wrong conclusion. The third party became quiet. Your soulmate continued, I don't know whether I should contact them. I don't know what they want now. But I know I don't want my last contribution to their life to be confusion. That sentence landed harder than anything that had come before. The third party finally understood that preventing communication would not erase the internal change already happening. Your soulmate was no longer thinking, how do I get them back? They were thinking, how do I become someone who tells the truth even when I cannot control the outcome? That was a different kind of growth. And strangely, it made everything feel calmer. Your soulmate was beginning to release the need for certainty. They did not know whether you would ever speak again. They did not know whether your paths would reconnect naturally, whether friendship would be possible, whether the story would remain a meaningful chapter rather than becoming something new. What they knew was simpler: if an honest conversation ever happened, they wanted to enter it without games. No pretending not to care. No trying to make you jealous. No vague statements designed to keep emotional control. No waiting for you to reveal everything first. They wanted to speak like someone who had finally learned the difference between vulnerability and weakness. But the third party still had one question left, and it was the question your soulmate had been avoiding from the very beginning. Why them? Your soulmate looked up. What? You keep talking about what you learned. You keep saying they mattered. But why them? What was actually different? For the first time, your soulmate had no prepared explanation. They could not answer with timing. They could not answer with attraction. They could not answer with history. Those things were true, but incomplete. The third party waited. Your soulmate looked away, almost toward a memory rather than a physical place. Then something unexpected crossed their expression, a softness that seemed to surprise even them. They made me want to be more honest, they said. The third party frowned slightly. Your soulmate continued. Not because they demanded it. Just because when I wasn't honest around them, I could feel myself creating distance. That was the first layer. Then came the second. And they saw things I didn't always say. A pause. Sometimes that scared me. The third party asked, why? Your soulmate smiled faintly. Because when someone sees you clearly, you can't hide behind the version of yourself that works with everyone else. Silence followed. There was nothing dramatic to add. The secret was finally exposing itself in its simplest form. You had reached a part of your soulmate that other people rarely reached, and instead of moving closer to that experience, they had sometimes backed away because being seen felt vulnerable. Now, after enough time and distance, they understood what they had mistaken for discomfort. It had not always been a warning that something was wrong. Sometimes it had been the unfamiliar feeling of emotional intimacy. That realization brought them back to one particular day with you. Nothing extraordinary happened that day. You were simply together, talking about ordinary things, when your soulmate had gone quiet. You noticed. You did not immediately ask what was wrong. You waited. A few moments later, you said something gentle, something like, you don't have to explain until you're ready. Your soulmate had almost forgotten that moment. But now it returned in perfect detail. They remembered the relief they felt. No pressure. No demand. Just presence. They remembered wanting to tell you everything right then and still being afraid to begin. Looking back, they realized that may have been one of the moments they felt safest with you and they had never told you. That became the final line they added to the private letter. There were moments you made me feel safe, and I was too guarded to tell you. Your soulmate read the sentence again and felt something soften. Not pain. Release. Because sometimes the truth is heavy only while it remains unnamed. Once spoken, even privately, it can begin becoming something gentler. Their friend later asked whether they planned to send the message. Your soulmate answered, "I'm not sure." Then why write it? Your soulmate looked at the screen. Because whether they ever read it or not, I needed to stop lying to myself about what happened. That answer marked a turning point. For perhaps the first time, your soulmate's understanding of you was no longer dependent on whether you returned. They were allowing the relationship to teach them something without demanding that the lesson guarantee a reunion. And paradoxically, that was what made the possibility of future communication feel more sincere. No agenda. No pressure. No attempt to control the response. Just the willingness to acknowledge what was true. The third party noticed this change too. Their behavior softened. There was less resistance when your name surfaced. Less need to interrupt. Less urgency to prove that your soulmate should forget. Perhaps they were beginning to understand that people cannot build secure relationships by forcing each other to erase meaningful parts of their past. Your soulmate's memories of you did not have to become an enemy. They simply had to become honest. One evening, the third party finally said something nobody expected. If you need closure, maybe you should have the conversation. Your soulmate looked genuinely surprised. You mean that? The third party hesitated. I don't know. I just know pretending this doesn't affect you hasn't worked. Your soulmate did not celebrate. They did not immediately reach for their phone. Instead they became even quieter. Because permission from the third party removed the external obstacle, leaving only the real obstacle behind, your soulmate's fear of what honesty might reveal. What if you answered warmly? What if you did not answer at all? What if you had moved forward? What if you had been waiting for exactly this conversation? Every possibility carried its own emotion. But beneath all of them was one certainty: your soulmate no longer wanted fear to decide what kind of person they became. The following morning, they opened the message again. This time they did not rewrite it. They did not add dramatic words. They simply read the lines they had already written and asked themselves one final question: is this message for me, or is it truly for them? If it was only about relieving their own regret, sending it might not be fair. If it was about offering you clarity without expecting anything in return, perhaps one day it could be worth sharing. That distinction mattered deeply. Your soulmate sat with it for hours. And then something happened that nobody had planned. A new detail about you reached them through someone else. Nothing private, nothing invasive, just a small update that suggested your life had changed in a meaningful way. Your soulmate smiled when they heard it. But immediately afterward, their expression changed, because this new information made the unsent message feel completely different. Suddenly, your soulmate realized that if they waited too long, the conversation they had imagined might no longer belong to the same chapter at all. And for the first time, the question was no longer simply whether they had the courage to tell you the truth. The question became whether they had finally understood what they wanted to say before life carried both of you somewhere entirely new.